Hey there, you absolute go-getter. Welcome back for another deep dive.
Always a pleasure to be back.
So today we're diving headfirst into this A Path to Thriving document you sent my way.
Uh, Melissa and Jorge's masterpiece.
Right. It's got everything. Meditation, intermittent fasting, even something called Jedi fuel.
Sounds intense.
Definitely intriguing. I gave it a read through, and honestly, it's a lot to unpack.
It really is. They've clearly poured decades of experience into this whole holistic lifestyle approach.
Yeah, and they don't shy away from calling it a permanent lifestyle shift, which honestly could feel a little overwhelming at first glance.
It could, but the good news is they really emphasize flying your own pace. It's not about turning your life upside down overnight.
That's a relief. Baby steps.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're all about sustainable change. And they're
Yep.
big on community support too, by the way.
Oh, yeah, the whole Thrive Hive thing, right?
Yes. Did you get a chance to check it out?
I did. It seems like they're really trying to build a supportive network around these ideas.
It makes such a difference, especially when you're making significant lifestyle changes. Having that network can really help with motivation and accountability.
For sure. Now, one thing that really jumped out at me was their whole take on glucose, or as they call it, insulin sanity,
Ah, yes. That's a big one for them, and for good reason.
right? They talk about how crucial stable glucose levels are for, well, pretty much everything. Can you break down why glucose is so important in the first place?
Well, think of glucose as your body's primary fuel source, like the gas that powers your car.
Okay, I'm following.
And insulin is like the key that unlocks your cells to let that glucose in.
So what happens when we're constantly spiking our glucose levels with sugary drinks and processed foods? It's like we're revving the engine but not going anywhere,
Yeah,
right?
it's more like we're jamming that key in the ignition over and over again. Eventually, it's going to wear and tear, and the lock won't work as well.
So that's the insulin resistance they're talking about. Our cells get worn out from all the glucose spikes and stop responding to insulin as effectively.
Exactly. And that's when things start to go haywire. Insulin resistance is linked to a whole cascade of health issues, not just blood sugar problems. We're
Really?
talking inflammation, fatigue, brain fog.
Wow, it's like a domino effect on our well-being.
They even list things like skin tags and premature aging as potential symptoms.
Seriously. Okay, that's way more than just a sugar crash. Now I'm starting to understand why they're so passionate about this.
They're very serious about it. They even use continuous glucose monitors themselves to see how different foods affect their levels in real time.
Wow, talk about dedication.
Yeah.
So, based on all that monitoring, what's their verdict? How do they recommend keeping our glucose happy?
They're all about a low-carb, high-fat, high-fiber way of eating. They've completely cut out anything that sends their glucose on a roller coaster ride.
Interesting. And they actually share some of their favorite meals and snacks later in the document, right?
They do. And I have to say, they sound pretty delicious.
Yeah.
But we can dive into those a little later.
Oh, you know I'm all about the food talk. But before we get there, let's talk about intermittent fasting. They're big proponents of that too, right?
Huge. And it ties directly into this whole glucose thing. They believe that intermittent fasting, combined with stable glucose levels, can trigger something called autophagy.
Autophagy. Okay, now we're getting technical.
It sounds more complicated than it is. Basically, autophagy is your body's way of cleaning house. Think of it like taking out the cellular trash.
I like the sound of that. My recycling bin is overflowing as we speak.
So when you fast, your body is like, hey, I've got all this extra energy, time to do some spring cleaning. It starts breaking down and recycling old, damaged cell parts and getting rid of toxins.
So less snacking, more internal decluttering. I can get behind that. What's their approach to intermittent fasting? Because it seems like there are a million different methods out there.
They keep it pretty simple. They recommend gradually shrinking your eating window each day, aiming for a 168 pattern.
168, so 16 hours of fasting and an 8-hour window for eating.
You got it. And get this, they claim that having those stable glucose levels actually makes fasting easier.
Okay, that's a win-win. Stable glucose makes fasting smoother, and fasting further promotes stability. It all starts to connect.
Exactly. It's all about creating those positive feedback loops.
I love it. So we've covered glucose, the importance of keeping it on an even keel, and how intermittent fasting fits into the equation. But there's so much more to unpack. I'm excited to dive into the rest of their plan. What else did you uncover in your deep dive?
Well, they're big believers in movement, but with a unique twist. They're not just talking about hitting the gym. It's about weaving movement into the fabric of your everyday life.
I love that. It's not about grueling workouts, but rather embracing mindful movement throughout the day.
Exactly. And they're huge fans of something called HIIT, which stands for High Intensity Interval Training.
HIIT, I've heard of that. It's all about short bursts of intense exercise followed by recovery periods, right?
You got it. And the beauty of HIT is that it's super effective and adaptable for any fitness level. They specifically mention using something called VO2 max to track their progress.
VO2 max. Now we're getting technical.
Don't worry, it's not as complicated as it sounds. VO2 max is basically a measure of how efficiently your body uses oxygen during exercise. And the higher your VO2 max, the fitter you are.
So it's like a measure of your cardiovascular fitness.
Exactly. And apparently it's a pretty good indicator of how long and how well you'll live, your lifespan and health span.
Wow, that's fascinating. It sounds like VO2 max is worth a deep dive of its own someday. But for now, tell me more about their movement as medicine approach. What else are they doing besides HIIT?
They're also really into yin yoga, which is a slower, more meditative style of yoga that focuses on holding poses for longer periods.
Yin yoga. I've dabbled in yoga here and there, but the idea of easing into those poses and letting go of tension sounds amazing.
Right. But here's the thing. They don't necessarily set aside specific time slots for yoga. They sprinkle it throughout their day. While watching TV, even cuddling.
Hold on, cuddling as yoga. Okay, now I'm convinced these two are living in the future of well-being, and I want it. They also mentioned something about a chai machine and backbend toys, right? Those have me seriously curious.
Don't they, though? They clearly embrace this idea of making movement a fun and integrated part of their lives. It's not a chore, it's just who they are.
I love that. Okay, so they're moving their bodies in all sorts of cool ways.
Right.
What about this NAD thing they mentioned? That sounded important.
It is. NAD stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. A mouthful, I know. It's a coenzyme that's vital for energy production and keeping your cells healthy.
So a crucial piece of our internal energy system. Got it. What did they have to say about NAD?
Well, they're really into its potential for something they call euthanasia.
Euthanasia. Okay, you have my full
Yeah.
attention.
Right. And it seems like exercise, intermittent fasting, and even cold immersion can support NAD production. They see it as a key to aging well and maintaining vitality.
Euthanasia, cold immersion. This just keeps getting more and more intriguing. We'll definitely have to unpack those concepts further. But first...
And they really didn't stop at the physical stuff either. They get into some seriously fascinating mental concepts like this inner control panel they call the switchboard.
Yes, that one really stuck with me too. It sounds kind of like a superpower, right? Like being able to tap into this inner control panel and suddenly making positive changes is easy. How'd they describe it?
Well, they're really into mindfulness, especially Vipassana meditation. They say through meditation, you start to hear that inner voice that's always saying, I can't or I shouldn't. But here's the thing. You learn to not let it control you.
Oh, I know that voice way too well.
Yeah.
Usually pops up when I'm trying parallel park or bake a cake.
Exactly. We've all got those voices. But imagine if you could acknowledge them without letting them call the shots. That's the power they think meditation can unlock.
So by tapping into the switchboard, you're basically rewiring how you respond to stuff. Like it's suddenly easier to resist that extra slice of cake or finally start that creative project you've been putting off.
Exactly. And they tie this directly to DOSE, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. Remember those feel-good chemicals?
Right. So how does DOSC play into this whole switchboard idea?
They're convinced that all these different elements, stable glucose, fasting, movement, mindfulness, they work together to boost your base DOSC levels. It's like this upward spiral of feeling amazing.
It's like all these good habits are feeding off each other and creating this symphony of well-being.
I like that. Symphony of well-being.
Right. But they weren't all just talk, were they? They actually shared some real-life stories and examples from their own journey, too, right?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the most relatable parts was about cravings. Like, how do you actually deal with those, especially when you're first making these changes? They admitted it wasn't always sunshine and rainbows, especially for one of them. Apparently, they had a wicked sweet tooth at one point.
So they're human. It's always comforting to hear that even people who seem to have it all figured out still face those everyday struggles. How'd they kick those cravings?
It's surprisingly straightforward.
Yeah.
Basically, they're all about eating before hunger really sets in, like staying ahead of the game.
Interesting. Proactive eating instead of reactive eating. I like it. Because once those cravings hit, it's game over.
Tell me about it. They really emphasized having a plan, always having yummy glucose-stabilizing snacks and meals ready so you're never caught off guard.
Speaking of yummy and glucose stabilizing, can we talk about the food? Because their whole approach to eating sounds surprisingly delicious, even with this focus on low carb and stable glucose. Like, what are they actually eating?
And they make it sound so good, right? Not restrictive at all.
Yeah.
They were saying their fridge is always stocked with things like avocados, smoked salmon, even homemade beef jerky.
Okay, you had me at smoked salmon. That's my kind of snack. What about meals? What are those looking like?
Simple and delicious seems to be the name of the game. They're big on high-quality beef, simply prepared, just salt, pepper, rosemary, maybe a little coconut oil. Also love shrimp and scallops, with some butter or aioli.
Yeah.
And smoked salmon with raw goat cheese and Granny Smith apples is another favorite.
Okay, now I'm starving. It all sounds so fresh and flavorful. And what about that Jedi fuel we talked about earlier? I don't think they went into much detail in the document, did they?
They didn't. We'll definitely have to put that in the show notes. But basically, it's this drink they've concocted, chamomile tea, cinnamon, apple cider vinegar, chlorophyll, a bunch of other good stuff.
It's like their secret weapon, especially if it tastes as good as their meals sound. But it's not all food and drinks, right? They also have those do-si-dos and don'ts lists, all those activities that can either increase or decrease your DOSE levels.
You're right. And some of them are pretty interesting. Like on the do list, you've got laughter, feeling accomplished, cuddling, getting a massage, basically all the best things in life. They also mention morning walks, Epsom salt baths, and get this, enemas.
Wait, enemas made the do-si-do list? Now that's dedication. I've got to admit, I'm a little curious about that one.
Me too.
Yeah.
They seem to be into cleansing and detoxing. And then on the flip side, the don't list has the usual suspects like carbs and alcohol, but also being in a constant state of high stress.
Makes sense. It's not just what you're putting in your body, but also what's going on in your head and your heart.
Absolutely. They emphasize how connected it all is, the physical, mental, and emotional, in order to feel truly healthy.
I love that they take such a holistic approach. It's so refreshing.
Yeah.
It really is. And speaking of holistic, remember those Thrive tokens we touched on earlier? They sounded like a fun way to build healthy habits.
They did, right. It's
Yeah.
like a point system they use for themselves. They give themselves Thrive tokens for doing anything that supports their well-being.
I love that. It's like gamifying your health journey. What kind of things are earning them these Thrive tokens?
Basically everything we've talked about. Sticking to their eating plan, completing their fasting windows, practicing yin yoga, meditating even, and this is where it gets interesting, those enemas we talked about.
Anima tokens. Okay, that's next level. But I get it. It's all about figuring out what works for you and making it fun. So what do they do with all these Thrive tokens? Cash them in for a prize at the end of the week.
You'd think so, right? But it seems like the real reward is just that feeling of accomplishment and the momentum it creates. They track their tokens, and that seems to be motivation enough for them. At least they didn't mention any grand prize system.
That's really interesting. It really highlights the power of intrinsic motivation. That satisfaction you get from just taking care of yourself. It's a cool perspective. What about those back bend toys we were wondering about earlier? They never really explained those, did they?
I know, right.
Okay.
I'm picturing those colorful bendy straws you get at the zoo,
Yeah.
but like a more advanced version. They did say they have them stashed all over their house, so they must be pretty serious about using them regularly.
It definitely tracks with their whole philosophy of making movement a natural part of life. It's not about forcing a workout. It's about finding fun ways to move your body throughout the day, which I love.
Me too. It's really inspiring. As we put all these pieces together for a path to thriving, one thing that really strikes me is just how much joy comes through in this whole document.
Totally. It's not about deprivation or forcing yourself to do things you hate. It's about finding that joy in taking care of yourself.
Exactly. And I think that's so important. It's not about perfection. It's about progress, having fun with it, and finding what truly makes you feel your best.
So well said. A path to thriving isn't about following a rigid set of rules. It's about exploring, experimenting, and creating a life that feels good for your mind, body, and soul. It's about tapping into that inner wisdom, that switchboard they talk about, and making choices that nurture your well-being on all levels.
Absolutely. And the most exciting part is taking these ideas and seeing how they fit into your own life. What resonates with you, and how can you make it your own?
Exactly. That's what we're all about here. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we'd love to hear from you. What are your biggest takeaways from Melissa and Jorge's approach? What excites you, and what questions do you still have?
And remember that Thrive Hive we mentioned earlier. It'd be amazing to connect over there and keep this conversation going. What are your biggest takeaways? What feels exciting or maybe a little challenging? We're in this together.
Until next time, happy thriving.